Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to SFF180. I hope those of you who are celebrating Thanksgiving are doing so responsibly this year, and that you're finding ways to celebrate the holiday that aren't putting you or any of your loved ones at unnecessary risk. We've all been feeling the isolation this entire year, but we don't want to make any mistakes that we'll later regret. In the hopes of starting out Thanksgiving Day on a lighter note, making mistakes that we later regret is a part of life. And writers are by no means immune. Everyone who works as a creative looks back on their early work and cringes a little bit. That's natural. On those rare occasions, you might look back on a piece of work you did at a certain time in your life and decide, yeah, maybe we can just sweep that one under the rug. Today, we're going to talk about 4 science fiction novels that have been disowned by their authors. And while it may not necessarily be the case that all or any of these books can fairly be called turkeys, definitely not some of them, it is the case that their authors, for reasons of their own, chose to distance themselves from books that they felt did not meet the standard of artistry they wished to represent. Ben Bova has written over 120 books in his long career, and at the age of 88, shows no signs of slowing down. It's inevitable that he would have something in all those years that he doesn't remember fondly, but the only one where he's gone on record saying so is his 1959 YA novel, The Star Conquerors. This book was published as part of the Winston science fiction series, a line of SF adventure novels through the 1950s and 60s, geared towards teenage boys, who were the audience science fiction publishing was most eager to cater to back then. Bova rather gently dismisses it as, quote, not my best book by far, but some people seem to remember it fondly. And it's no wonder it's not regarded as a timeless classic, because it's basically a checklist of cheesy genre tropes, stock wooden characters, dialogue and prose that bring to mind Truman Capote's legendary line, "That's not writing, that's typing." It's the story of young manly man Jeff Noland, inspired by Alexander the Great, for God's sake, leading the forces of Earth in battle against dastardly lizard aliens. Pulp collectors have kept the book alive to the extent that a new paperback edition came out around 5 years ago, with Ben Bova's blessing, but if you want to check it out on a more risk-free basis, it's up on the Internet Archive. J.G. Ballard was one of the most innovative speculative fiction writers associated with the new wave of the late 60s and early 70s. And in later years, his work entered the consciousness of the general public through movie adaptations of such titles as Crash, the David Cronenberg movie, not that terrible Oscar winner, the dystopian black comedy High Rise, and his autobiographical novel Empire of the Sun. But Ballard's first novel, way back in 1961, was a little thing called The Wind from Nowhere, which, while it was very much in keeping with themes he would return to later in his career, like environmental disaster and class conflict, it's a book Ballard eventually came to dismiss as a piece of hackwork that he just cranked out for the money. The story relates what happens when wind conditions around the globe reach such a level of intense strength that buildings are blown over, cities are flattened, and even huge bodies of water like the Great Lakes are emptied out. While survivors huddle underground in tunnels and government agencies make a futile effort to stave off the worst of the disaster, a billionaire with his own private army moves ahead with plans to construct a massive pyramid structure designed to withstand the wind. Doesn't turn out too well. In a 1975 interview, Ballard explained that the book came out of his frustration that his writing career was stalling out, and that he had not yet been able to break into the paperback market. His wife set him a challenge to write a novel in a fortnight, and that's what Ballard did, pounding out The Wind from Nowhere in 10 days at a rate of 6,000 words a day, which translates to about 24 typed and finished manuscript pages per day. Ballard did indeed sell the book for £300. That's a little over £6,700 in today's money. But while The Wind from Nowhere on its own wasn't anything he was especially proud of, it served the very important purpose of getting the creative juices flowing, and Ballard immediately went on to write the acclaimed book that he considered his true debut novel, 1962's The Drowned World. Probably no writer has publicly expressed regret for any of his past novels more than Anthony Burgess, and the book he would go on to confess he was ashamed of having written was the brutal 1962 dystopia A Clockwork Orange, which would go on to be made into an unflinching movie by Stanley Kubrick in 1971 that retains the capacity to shock audiences today. The story takes place in a near-future society overrun by teenage gang violence, and our viewpoint character is the sociopathic Alex, who leads his gang of droogs on nightly orgies of wanton mayhem until the inevitable moment when his own gang turns on him and he's picked up by the police. In prison, Alex doesn't realize what he's getting into when he undertakes an experimental behavior modification treatment called the Ludovico technique, expecting to be able to manipulate and charm his way into having his sentence commuted. But as he eventually finds out, it's going to be one of those situations where the cure proves almost worse than the disease. After the Kubrick movie became both an international hit and a magnet for controversy and debate, Burgess began to express misgivings about the book and its impact on culture. Now, to be fair, he had kind of a point. A Clockwork Orange developed a fan base not unlike that which later gravitated to Fight Club, a fan base who misunderstood that these were stories savagely critical of the propensity for violence among disaffected males that they appear to be valorizing on the surface. Basically, any Fight Club fan who finds Tyler Durden aspirational has missed the point. But there's a bigger conversation here about whether stories that wallow in human depravity can really be effective as a form of enlightened social commentary when their very depiction of that which they intend to condemn is so easily open to misinterpretation. It's a lot like the one filmmaker, I forget who, it may have been Jean-Luc Godard, who once said it was impossible to make an effective anti-war movie because movies always make war look exciting. Though I would counter that by saying Kubrick himself managed to pull off the most effective anti-war movie ever made, so I suppose you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Concerns over misunderstanding eventually consumed Burgess, who said, quote, "The film made it easy for readers of the book to misunderstand what it was about, and the misunderstanding will pursue me until I die. I should not have written the book because of this danger of misinterpretation." Still, Burgess allowed himself to be involved in some dodgy stage adaptations of the book in the 1990s, perhaps hoping he was rehabilitating it. Finally, you wouldn't think that one of science fiction's most revered talents would have reason to turn her back on any of her work, but Octavia Butler did so with her 1978 novel Survivor, which has become the red-headed stepchild, so to speak, of her Patternist series, and a book she's brushed off as her Star Trek novel, which probably won't make Star Trek fans happy. It's the story of a group of human colonists called the Missionaries, who make their way to an alien world after fleeing the Clayark plague that has ravaged the Earth. The planet they settle on has an intelligent species called the Cone, divided into two tribes, one of whom helps the missionaries, although they end up having ulterior motives. The other tribe attacks the settlement, capturing several people, including our protagonist, Alana, who goes on to assimilate into the tribe's culture successfully, eventually marrying their leader and having his child. Alana then goes on to help the missionaries break free from the control of both Cone tribes. So the themes here are assimilation and how to find a sense of belonging in a culture that's alien to you, all the while dealing with the outsider's fear of mixing, so to speak. A number of critics have seen this, naturally, as a metaphor for race and the Black experience. And among those who have read Survivor, the book is definitely not considered bad. Joe Walton describes it as excellent and considers it very credibly positioned within the broad landscape of feminist science fiction from the 1970s. As an example of anthropological SF, its premise can be seen in a lot of the work by C.J. Cherryh, as well as books like Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card. But Octavia repudiated it on the grounds that there was something inescapably colonialist, not to mention just plain cliché, about the whole concept of going to an alien planet and getting it on with the hot natives. And while I've always found Butler's work to be interrogating the themes she explores, however cheesy a superficial reading of them might appear, I guess Butler didn't think her work on Survivor was up to her standard, and she quickly allowed the book to go out of print. You can find it today without too much difficulty if you're prepared to drop a ridiculous stack of money. And that's all I have time for on today's episode. One final word, though. As a working artist, you'll have work you're proud of and work you aren't, and sometimes work you're genuinely embarrassed by. But in the end, any piece of work you do is a stop on your creative journey. Sometimes it'll be a stop that tells you you need to get off the train you're currently on and board one going another direction. But the work you don't like is just as valid and has a lot more to teach you in its own way as your best work. So thanks a lot for joining me. Remember, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, share it far and wide with all of your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe if you have not yet done so. That is how the channel grows. You can also support the channel at my TeePublic store and at my Patreon, where recruits into Wink's Army get little perks like getting to see some of my videos early access, depending on if I finish them in time. But I want to thank all of those people for their wonderful support. It is greatly appreciated, especially in these difficult times. I want to thank all the rest of you guys for being the very best viewers in all of BookTube, and until I see all of you next time, please have a safe and happy holiday, and until then, happy reading.